Yeah, someone said it's an old Yaesu is an FT8, so good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run fairly quickly through the normal FT8, fairly quickly through the new Dxpedition mode that works 5 times as fast, do some comparisons between FT8 and the other digital modes which are within the WSJT-X suite. Then I've been asked by the conference organisers to predict what's going to happen after 2020. And that's pretty hard because if you'd asked me 12 months ago to predict FT8, I wouldn't have predicted it, so we'll have a go. Okay. Oh dear, this thing. Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Okay. FT8, the F stands for Steve Franke, who was the guy who had the first conceptual idea about FT8. And the T stands for Joe Taylor, who implemented it within the WSJT suite. They're both professors in the US, but neither of them claim to be experts in communications. They sort of say they're cut and try ham types who have a go at this and have a go at that and see what works. They do amazingly well. The 8 stands for 8 tones, frequency shift keying, and it uses low density parity check coding, LDPC. This is the latest, you've probably heard about codes like Reed-Solomon coding and convolutional coding and turbo coding. LDPC is the latest version, which works slightly better than all of its predecessors. The background to it is interesting. It was discovered by a PhD student doing his thesis back in 1965, but he didn't know, he knew the theory, but there was no computer in 1965 that could do all the processing. And in fact, in the way he envisaged it, there's no computer today that could process it. A guy named Tanner in about 1990 something found an algorithm that simplified the processing and made it viable. And today, we can actually operate these sort of codes with ordinary PCs with the Tanner graph. The other thing that's interesting is it uses Costas arrays for sync. Now, anyone who's been familiar with the sync method in, say, JT65 will note that it has a single tone sync, which you see, and the message tones are to the right, which if the signals are weak, you don't see them. With the sync method is called a Costas array, and it's actually an array in both frequency and time. And Costas invented this because it was the best way of finding a submarine or something when you're running a sonar system to detect the enemy before they detected you. And while it gives about 4 dB advantage, that's the difference between you being blown up before they blow you up, and that's well worth having. What Joe Taylor has done, he's reduced the sync energy to 25% because he's got the 4 dB advantage, and he's still, compared to 50%, and he's still another dB in front using the Costas array. The TX period is only 15 seconds compared to most of the other WSJT-X modes, and that means it's 4 times as fast. personally, that the penalty of being 4 times as fast is it's 6 dB less sensitive. Now, I'm a weak signal person, and I don't like the idea of giving up 6 dB. But I'm obviously wrong, because the ham community has decided that giving up 6 dB and going 4 times as fast is the way to go in this world. And I guess that's the instant gratification world, which I'm probably too old for. You might be too. Joe Taylor originally thought this, Joe and Steve Franklin originally thought this would be good for 6-metre multi-hop sporadic E, on the basis that the faster times would let you get through. And the idea is, with multi-hop sporadic E, one of the hops along the way might be coming on for a minute and another for another minute, but they all come on for different times. And by going through in 15 seconds, it might work. Looking at Kevin, who was doing some multi-hop sporadic E on 6 metres, surprising that no one actually took up FT8 for multi-hop sporadic E to South America. And I think the reason is giving up 6 dB on a long path is more than you want to do. Now, perhaps that's different if you're in North America and you start with a kilowatt instead of 100 watts, but that's a surprise to me. Now, let's move forward. Why I called this talk the FT8 Revolution is this is a set of graphs that came from different modes being reported on club log. Now, club log's for people who are interested in DX, so it's not representative what everybody uses every day for chatting, but you can see the yellow graph shows that FT8, that was the 1st of January to the 31st of December last year. FT8 appeared about in the middle of last year, and suddenly, by December, it's over 50% of all of the QSOs being reported on club log. Modes like JT65 and JT9 crashed. Even CW and phone dropped off a little. I mean, they dropped off as a percentage of what might be a larger value. And primarily this is all on HF, for which FT8 was never designed for. That was a surprise to Joe Taylor, but it just shows you that the instant gratification community is such that they all get attracted to doing QSOs 4 times as fast. Now, what it looks like, if you go on 20 metres, see all these little, is there a pointer? I'll stretch over here. See all these little blobs? These are all separate FT8 signals in an SSB passband. You can see that it goes down from a few hundred hertz up middle. Oh yes. From a few hundred hertz up to 2.5 kilohertz. And it's basically within an SSB passband. And this was a weekend. And you can see, well, dozens or more FT8 signals. Some of them are strong, some of them are weak. This is 0708's up there, 070800, well, no, perhaps more sensibly if I went to here, 070815, and it's still 070815, so it's decoded and still going 20 or 30 stations. I have seen up to 60 stations decode in one 15-second period. What is also interesting is if you look at the frequencies, if we go to the 0815, you'll see it started off at 510 hertz and then 594, increasing in frequency, right up to 2.1 kilohertz, decoding all these stations. Once it's decoded all those stations, the program knows what's on that file, subtracts them from the file, and then has another go at decoding all the stations underneath. And so it starts again at the low frequency. So in this period, it's gone through and found another 10 odd stations who are hidden under the ones who were there in the first place. I have seen situations where a signal that was 30 dB over, and when it went back the second time, it found another signal underneath it that was 15 dB below the noise. You know, it's over 40 dB difference, and it's digging a signal out. Right, now the only other thing to note is if a station's calling CQ, it lights them up in green so you can decide to click on a station you want to work. One of the problems with 15-second periods is it transmits for about 12.8 seconds, so that gives you 2.8 seconds to react to decide which station you want to work. But if you see a green one and you think, oh, you know, I want to work Greece, you click on them and you've got 2.5 seconds to do it. and you can work them. Now, one of the things is the rest of the QSO, if you do it manually, is going to, when they come back to you and send a report, then you've got to send a report with Roger, and you've still only got 2.5 seconds. But what they've done is, for the rest of the QSO, they built in what they call auto-sequencing. So once it's detected the station you're working, it actually does all the work for you, right through to sending 73, if you tick the auto-sequencing box. If you don't like the computer helping you, well, then you've got to just work pretty hard. Now, in 90 minutes, I detected all of these countries calling CQ on 20 metres. I have seen reports that it's possible to get DXCC in a weekend. And some of the time you see stations at places, I mean, I'm used to working on VHF, so I usually recognise what call signs I'm working, they're VK somebody, and I see call signs that I've got no idea where they come from. Fortunately, you can tick a box and it tells you which country the call sign's from when it's in the program. No. Okay. Last sporadic E season, I went through, and it was very obvious that just about all 6-metre activity had gone to FT8. Now, I went through the Adams logger and counted how many FT8 QSOs were reported, and that would not be all of them by any means. And this is the sort of, over the sporadic E season, this is from, you know, from about starting in November, peaking up around Christmas at about 200 QSOs a day, and tailoring off. And you don't even have to tune your radio because everybody's on the same frequency And if there's a sporadic E opening between me and Queensland, I see the Queenslanders. I'm only using a 4-element beam, so it's not very directive, and I can see VK5s at the same time and ZLs at the same time. And you just sit there and work the 6 metre sporadic E. Not like the old days where people are on point 1 and say QSY up to whatever, and you'd lose them and by the time you got there. Yeah. Here's a comparison with when am I going to have to finish, by the way?
You've got 8 minutes.
8 minutes? We started 10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. This is a comparison with the other modes in JT6 in the WSJT-X suite. And the first thing you notice is FT8 works down to about minus 21 dB compared to other modes working as far as, well, modes that you can communicate rather than just identify, like Whisper, up to minus 28. So it's going to FT8 is costing you about 7 dB. And that's primarily due to the fact that it's trying to do it in 15 seconds rather than 60 seconds. So a quarter of the time costs you 6 dB. So the biggest constraint on performance is how much time you've got, as Claude Shannon found out a long time ago. The next most important thing is how much of the time that you do actually transmit do you waste sending sync. And so you can see modes like JT65 waste 50% of the time spending on sync, whereas modes that use Costas arrays are only using 25% of the time on sync. And that immediately gives you, going from 50% on your messages to 75% on your messages, immediately gives you about 1.5 dB. Mightn't sound much, but every dB counts. After that, the other things that are important is how many bits do you send in each message. If you send more bits, you're not going to get the same performance in the same time. Now, FT8 actually uses 75 bits compared to most of these only 72. And when he first brought that out, I wondered why the hell he put 3 bits there for no good reason. But we will find out shortly. So sending 75 bits costs you just a little bit, probably 0.1 of a dB compared to 72 bits. If you go to Whisper, you only send 50 bits, so that really helps, and you're sending it for twice as long again as these modes, and that helps again. So while Whisper's not an exceptionally sensitive mode, because it spends so much time, you get the extra sensitivity. The next most important thing is what coding method you use, and both FT8 and QRA use low density parity check codes, which are, I'm not sure whether they're in your telephones yet, but they'll certainly be in your telephones within the next year or two. The world is going to change to LDPC coding for everything. Doesn't pick up that much. For instance, the difference between Reed-Solomon LDPC is about 1.2 dB. But if you're running a mobile phone network and you pick up 1.2 dB and you're paying for spectrum, then it's worth having. Both FT8 and QRA can gain up to a further 3 dB, and so can JT65 and JT4, by using prior knowledge. Most people know their own call sign, and if they're getting a message with their own call sign, you probably heard it referred to as deep search in JT65. That helps. If you know both call signs, as you progress in a QSO, you know both call signs and all you're trying to get is the signal report. That helps. So these modes, because they're very good at gaining sync, they can actually work with prior knowledge at least another 3 dB down. Against that, JT9 only spends 19% of its time on sync, but it's got no reserve to go any lower. So while it'll work to -27, because it doesn't spend much time on sync, almost as good as QRA. QRA can pick up another 3 or 4 dB as you progress the QSO. Right. Now, just to explain what a Costas array, the normal sync method in most of the modes is a single tone that you see down the waterfall like that. When you have a Costas array, it's built into the tones. These are a mixture of Costas arrays and message tones. And so that you can see the Costas array, I blanked out all the message tones, and you can see this repeating pattern. And this is 3 Costas arrays which are used to get sync. The advantage of using 3 is if there's some drift on the signal, it can actually correct for drift between here and here and here. And by adding the 3 together, it improves the sensitivity. Now, this picture is actually a QRA picture because it was easier for me to sort out. FT8 transmits its Costas array so fast that I can't get a nice picture on the waterfall, but in fact, that's exactly the same as that, but a bit hard to pick it out on the waterfall. So pros and cons, 4 times as fast as JT65. It's reasonably sensitive, so it can cope with all this noise that we were talking about this morning. You see all the activity in an SSB passband. It's great for watching for sporadic E openings on 6 metres. I mean, some of the time the band's actually not open. You just leave it running and you walk out and make your cup of tea and you come back and you find who's on. LDPC decoding, best for efficiency. Costas arrays we've talked about. And because it's basically just signal reports, call signs, doesn't matter what language, you're picking up stations from Indonesia and countries who don't speak English, but we all speak to each other in FT8. It is only a minimal QSO, meets the requirements, and you certainly don't do any rag chewing. Now, the reason he had the extra 3 bits is he had in mind that he wanted to go even faster. And the way he went faster, he developed a mode where he actually transmits up to 5, you can see 5 FT8 signals there. And so he transmits to 5 stations at a time. A little quirk is he uses these extra bits so he can not only transmit to 5 stations at a time, you can see he's sending here, he's sending ND2 from this is himself say, he's sending him a -16 report, but he's also sending RR73 to the G station in the same bit. So each of these 5 is actually transmitting information to 10 stations. Well, not each of the 5, the total of 5 is transmitting. So in theory, it's 10 times as fast. However, the downside is to transmit 5 signals at once, you have to have a linear system. And that means if you add 2 signals together linearly as a voltage, it costs you 6 dB. If you put 5 signals there linearly, it costs you 14 dB. I've participated in some of his tests and there's never been any decent propagation. I've seen the Americans calling him, but because his power is down 14 dB, he was only running effectively 4 watts for me to look for. I never saw him. So these are not my results. I put a request on the web that I was going to give a talk, and could someone give me some examples? And a guy from Croatia gave me these beautiful examples. So you can see what's happening here. This guy is sending K5RKS a -10 report, and then in the next period he sends him 73, RR73. Now, the other little trick that he's doing, he's also, when he sends you a report, he tells your rig to move down below 1000 hertz away from all the QRM. So the people who are calling him at the start are all working at 1000 hertz upwards in a great dog pile. Once he's picked you out, he sends you some of these bits which tell you to tune down your rig, and this is all done automatically in the program if you've got cat control, so you're out of the noise. Where he puts you is random below 1000 hertz, so while this station might have been the first decode in there, once he moved him down, see, he's come down to 4, well, not sure what's happened there, but you can appear in a different order once he moves you down. Now, this is my Croatian friends sent me a picture so I could see what's going on of both periods. So he was just receiving. So in this period, here's what they call the Fox, transmitting 5 signals and 5 signals again. In the next period, here's all the hounds calling him, and here's a couple of hounds or 3 hounds that have been moved down below 1000 hertz to actually have a contact. If they're calling you, so you see your station light up in red. If the Fox, in this case was K1JT, is just calling CQ, it lights up in green, so you can start the procedure. Now, the theme of this conference was Beyond 2000, and that's beyond my pay grade, 2020, sorry. However, there's a few things I will mention. First of all, Shannon limit, and we are that close to the Shannon limit. I don't think there's going to be any method of decoding that's going to appreciably improve the world. And by that I mean, I'd be very surprised if we see another 0.1 of a dB in the next 5 years, because we're already within about 0.2 or 0.3 of a dB of the Shannon limit. And the Shannon limit itself has some constraints. The limit only applies if you're transmitting an infinitely long message, and we're transmitting fairly short messages. Now, one thing I think could be done is if you apply the Costas array sync method and the LDPC coding to Whisper, you could pick up another 2.5 dB on Whisper, and I think that would be worth having. This is a bit of a long shot. You could, we're at present wasting 25% of our energy to gain sync. There's no reason why you couldn't gain sync directly from GPS time sources, and that would save you another 1.25 dB. Whether amateurs consider having sync coming not by amateur radio as still a QSO might be an issue. We could reduce the information contact from 72 bits to about 62 bits by not having the option of sending grid squares. That might gain half a dB. If we're prepared to spend more time, we can gain 3 dB every time we double it. Wider passbands with SDRs allow you to transmit more bits. But for short messages, the gain is pretty minimal, but that's a possibility. On the basis that I had really no clue what was going to happen after 2020, my solution is wait for Joe Taylor. But Joe will be 80 years old. And this whole revolution in digital modes depends really on Joe Taylor. If his group includes some very skilled people, there's a G-Station who's an excellent programmer. In terms of QRA, there was a very good communication engineer who helped him, but that guy, and it's an Italian, who's got his own company that works for the Italian Defence Force, and he thinks it's more important for his company to survive than keep producing ham radio. So you're really relying on people who are retired, like Joe Taylor, to put all this effort in, and I don't know where the replacement for Joe Taylor is coming, and I think that's the biggest risk to all of this. I've run out of time, thank you, but I'll ask any quick questions.
Rex, what's the certainty on those decodes? There's no indication of certainty, there's no stars.
You're talking about false decodes. Yeah. FT8, if you run it, you will probably see false decodes 1 in 100. QRA, I ran a simulation of QRA for the equivalent of 3 months, and I got 2 false decodes. You can see that even though I was asked to talk about FT8, I'm actually in love with QRA. Thank you. Yes? Yes? Were you just letting it run in the noise? Yeah. I mean, if you've got a noisy band without any signals, you might get that sort of numbers. But if there's actual signals there that are decoding, I would think it'd be a lot lower than that. Yes.
It's not so much a question. I've been writing an ad on software that actually will process the logs from WSJT-X. Still being developed, but what it does is it does allow you to track who you've been working and that sort of thing. There'll be a new version go up on the website probably within the next week that'll solve a couple of bugs that I'm aware of. But if you look for VK4ADC.com, you'll find a link on that.
Right. Covered it all, thank you.